Good morning, everyone, and warm welcome to all who are joining us today for this discussion about harnessing data from within and beyond. Honestly, whenever we're talking about data, we all know that data is the new currency for today's era. And we're flooded with a lot of information and a lot of data around us. And if we're talking about data, there are a lot of questions that comes to our mind, like what data is benefit to us, and what are the challenges, and how we can utilize it to benefit humanity. So to start this conversation within this panel, I would like to ask you, Ms. Yana, like what kind of data is really important among all the data that we do have, and how we can share this data effectively?
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here and to follow this opening remarks, if I can just deviate a little bit, is a tough call because I think Her Excellency managed in this most succinct, eloquent talk to string all the important elements into this beautiful strand. So she's pretty much made the case for all of us. So I'll try to fill perhaps some of the intervals that she left open for us to talk about. So within the group on Earth observation, as the name suggests, we really think of data as encompassing of all kind of data that comes from varieties of sources that give us information about the Earth and the Earth system. So when we talk about data, we are thinking about observations of physical, chemical, biological, but also socioeconomic variables, and observing their change over time in order to construct our understanding of what goes on our mother planet Earth. But data in itself is just a raw material. It's just raw commodity. As Her Excellency pointed out, its real value is realized when it's processed, when it's analyzed, when insights are generated, packaged in the kind of format that can actually deliver actionable information to any decision makers, be they public entities or businesses or citizens. The thing about data, it's just like in that symphony. For it to make sense, we do need all of the elements to play their part, but they all need to be connected to give us that holistic view of the question that we're trying to answer. And one important thing that makes it happen and to be shared across communities and societies is something as boring as protocols and standards. So it's really critical that the entities, whether it is data providing organizations who share their original source data, or if it's aggregators, data aggregators like Amazon, Microsoft, Planetary Computer, Google, they are all using those very critical standard-based protocols, APIs, which allow then these pieces of the orchestra to actually communicate and spread all the data and the information they provide throughout our global ecosystem. And then, of course, come a whole myriad of other platforms which are chosen by the user community themselves, from national sort of data sharing infrastructures to regional, continental scale. Like last year, I believe there was a Middle East, North Africa big data regional hub launched, to global scale data platforms. And from our side, I think I would just say where the investments into this data are really being realized time and time again is when the data that becomes intelligence and then becomes knowledge through its use and application gets actually shared globally. Because it's that experience of having applied that data in decision-making processes that generates the learning. And then that learning, when shared within the global community, can indeed become the tool of empowerment. So all data matters, but data alone doesn't matter. It's when data gets used as tools that provide intelligence and insights, generate knowledge and learning, which then is shared, is when we really realize the full potential of data. But to do that, we have to take care of those boring little pesky things like standards and protocols.
Thank you for your insight. So for us to get valuable data, as even Her Excellency mentioned, it gets back to the basics of collection of data. Professor, talk to us more about like what are the challenges and the limitations when it comes to collection of data and even using it?
I do it like this so that I can also look to the left and to the right. So good morning, everybody. And I must join Yana. It was amazing how well the minister collected everything in one strand. So what can we add? First of all, yes, data are absolutely necessary, and data collection is necessary. But the first question is, which data? Which data do we need? Which data do we want? So that's the first question to define, because we can collect whatever we want. It wouldn't give the result if we would not have the right data. And it has to be not only the right data, it has to be the quality of the data. So you need quality checks. You need to define which quality the data have to have. And that's already the first challenge. The second challenge is you cannot store all data. You have to reduce the data. So how to reduce? And there comes the word of bias. What the minister said, that everybody has a bias, also in research. In research, there can also be an unconscious bias, because you don't know what you really need. So that's an intrinsic bias to some extent. So you have to reduce without having the risk to reduce it by things which you need. So it's, to my mind, it's an iterative process also. You collect data, you learn to use these data, and then you need an iteration because you might have new you will have new information definitely, and with this new information, you have an iterative process. The next challenge is you have then to run through the data again, maybe to collect new data and to run through the old data again. And there's a challenge which is called energy, because it all needs power. So you better invest a lot of thinking in order to reduce the amount of power, because if you need too much power, you can't reanalyze the data. So these are all the challenges. And then comes the biggest challenge. You have to transform the data into knowledge. And maybe that's really the biggest challenge, to do that. Because you can collect whatever you want, you must use it. You must use it in order to bring us forward. And there you have to have an idea what you want to find, or in which direction, not exactly what, because that would be already a bias. So in which direction do you want to do your research? And again, there you are then in an iterative process. And again, what Yana said, you need to share it and you need to do it with others together. You alone, you cannot do that. So I think these are the challenges which you can master once you know the direction where your goal is lying. But you have to keep in mind you need a lot of preparatory time, a lot of iterations, and I think a lot of ingenuity in particular, and that's another challenge which I just forgot. If you want to make a disruptive change, how can you define the disruption beforehand? So again, I think one needs an iteration there in order to get an disruptive change. So there are a lot of challenges, but you can master it. And I think that's a positive end of this point.
That's really great insight. So always with the opposite of challenges, there is the other face of opportunities. And I believe like technology can play a great role in that. Mr. Clint, how can we utilize really technology to facilitate data usage? Like Professor is saying, like we do have to revise the data that we want as we create more understanding. So how can we meet these kind of demands of different data using the technology that we do have?
Well, thank you very much. You know, one of the things that's happening is change. Like, change is just a part of how we live and how we work. And this evolution of the technology that I've dedicated my life to is GIS has undergone enormous transformation in these last few years. The internet has actually changed everything. The interesting thing about geographic data is everything happens somewhere. So every bit of information in the world typically can be geolocated somewhere on the planet or some other planet or moon, depending on what the context of the problem is. And the idea that you can bring different sets of data together, unforeseen in the past, is really kind of a big breakthrough for what's going on. I was just thinking last night about some of the things we've seen in this new web GIS pattern. For example, Landsat 8 has a heat sensor, and that heat sensor can be used to make maps of cities that show you where the warm parts of the cities are, places where trees could be planted, and places that have nice shade around them. That's kind of amazing. I saw it from my hometown last fall. Like that idea of that information coming to life was really new. The other thing that we see a lot of, like if you look at the European Space Agency and their work, their Sentinel missions are just stunningly capable. In the past 6 years, the Sentinel-2 missions have produced amazing information. They have a revisit rate. Every 10-meter pixel on the planet is revisited every 5 days. And the work that was done by a company called Impact Observatory was to use AI and machine learning to take about, I think it's around 24,000 sample plots around the world. And using machine learning, they turned that into over 1 million sample plots. And imagine this, the entire year's worth of imagery, all of that content for each year from 2017 through 2022 now have been used to create an annual land cover map at 10-meter resolution. And when you start to think about how we do kind of continental and global planning of things, how does that information roll up? That's one of the interesting things about raster data or imagery data. It's, you know, there are these cells that are used where cells can nest in other cells. In other words, you can take a data cube of lots of layers, like in the United States. All observations for species at risk have been collected for over 25 years, have been turned into a data cube of about 2,700 separate layers, one for each species, about where it had been located. And that information was used to generate a map of probability of occurrence, not for all species, but for each individual species. I mean, it's kind of just enormous breakthroughs in what can happen. So one of the patterns that's been emerging have been this kind of community content. At ESRI, we started to build something we call the Living Atlas of the World. And it's this collection of, I'll say, curated content, the best available content. Just imagine about all subjects, both imagery and raster and things like that, population, statistics, transportation, health, everything. And there's about 10,000 layers that we've been curating. We add a few layers every month to that. We continuously keep it updated. What it represents is it represents the work of the global geospatial community. All of their work is coming to life. And that idea of data becoming available is really another one about, well, how do you synthesize that data and put it into a form where people can do computation with it and drive real answers to really pressing problems? And I think that's a big lesson for us, have always been just the amazing work. Like you look at the EU and Inspire, groups like that have done just a wonderful job at kind of building that ethic about information sharing across our community. So I'm really excited about what the GIS community can offer to things like the Sustainable Development Goals.
That's honestly great. Combining multiple layers of information to reach the whole benefit to reach society and humanity is the ultimate goal. I would really like to hear from each one of you, like from your own experiences, what are some examples of how data were used to ultimately benefit humanity? And we can start with you, Ms. Yana.
I have to pick a favorite, and nobody likes to do that, right? No favorites. But we can talk about some life-saving sort of scenarios where, and again, I represent a global partnership, really multilateral partnership, where I think the real value is the willingness of the different communities from around the world, from research science to technology and policy, to actually co-develop and co-design solutions, and through that process build social capital, which, by the way, one of the things that Her Excellency was talking about is how do we take on risk and how we address risk. And let's just be clear, governments they really don't love to lean into risk. So it is really this exercise of building the social capital that sort of develops that platform of trust and confidence that sort of tells us, you know what, go ahead and innovate and try something new. So through this multilateral collaboration, we've actually developed a number of services that in some cases have allowed countries to anticipate significant risks. Like in the case of Uganda, for example, where the Prime Minister's office wanted to create a social safety net program, and by subscribing to Global Risk Finance Facility, sort of looking for ways to create national level warning systems to trigger the warning early enough that the government could then receive the payouts effectively from this insurance to provide proactive assistance to the population. So through our programs, we worked with the government of Uganda to develop their national level crop monitor early warning system, which, using the information about the different types of variables, triggered 3-month warning to let them know that in that season they would not be able to expect the expected level of crop yields. And that allowed them to trigger the insurance, basically, and receive the payouts, which then they used to provide alternative means of livelihoods to the population, which depended on the crops which are rain-fed, which they wouldn't have. So by being able to take that anticipatory action, they really saved a lot in terms of cost that they would have had to use then to subsidize things after the event, and really a major disruption to the lives and livelihoods of the people. So a number of such programs that we've put in place that our member states do like to leverage because they represent sort of that international collaborative kind of output that, as Clint was saying, takes the best of the best and puts in the context that can be trusted by the national entities.
That's honestly very powerful. Professor, from your experience, give us an example of, from the different set of data that you deal with, how data was used to benefit humanity.
Well, I think at the moment one can discuss if it was good for the humanity or not so good. But 1989, the World Wide Web was born at CERN. So that was, of course, a fantastic achievement. I'm no longer so sure if this is so. I think it's good for humanity, but on the other hand, it also is a challenge for humanity to keep it under control. Yeah, and it was given free to humanity, free to the society. This is why we have one web, and not many different ones for which you have to pay, etc. So that helps, of course, to communicate, to exchange information, and I think it also helps, to my mind at least, to bring people together. Yeah. So I think it's a big advantage. The other point is that we have learned to work together globally in a similar way as you just described it. And I think there is essentially nothing in the world we can solve ourselves alone. We need to work together. For me, personally, the best example of working together, analyzing data, was the discovery of the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider, of course. So I have to bring in a little bit of my research.
What are your thoughts, Mr. Clint?
Well, I have a few thoughts about this. Is it coming on? Hello? There it is. Yeah, so this is an interesting time with what's going on, and it's just a lot of thoughts popped into my head, like the development of the internet and what it became is pretty magnificent. What's interesting across our communities is that sharing ethic is, I think, bred into everybody who applies GIS, because we're all so hungry for information, and there's always at least some information that we don't have, and we don't have access to it unless we know somebody, or we can identify what that source is. And it's just so beautiful when we can bring those things together. That's the neat thing about GIS, is because everything's geo-referenced, it's just this idea that layers can be brought together in really interesting ways, and some problems that you would never think about being kind of addressed with this technology, and addressed like that. Like when the pandemic started, the outbreaks of COVID had started in China. There was a young man, he had just started his graduate program at Johns Hopkins University, and he went to his professor and he said, my mother and father live in China, right in Wuhan. He says, I want to show my parents what's going on with COVID. And this was at a time where nobody really knew anything, but the first COVID dashboard, his professor, Lauren Gardner, his name is Ensheng Dong. The two of them started the Johns Hopkins dashboard, and they had it up and running in 2 days. Literally 2 days. And of course, it started getting hacked the third day, something like that. But over time, that thing grew to be this magnificent system. And it's just all these principles that we all learn about. Like they could just scrape content off the web. That's the first way they did it. Eventually they went to really robust methods to protect the data and things like that. But to build the application, that idea of a dashboard and reporting on things is one of the universal applications across all fields, and is so important. And interestingly, that dashboard got used by the end of the first year. By the end of 2020, it had been viewed 2 trillion times. It's kind of amazing, for this little dashboard to do that. And what's interesting about it is the World Health Organization in the US, the CDC, those scientists were really focused on doing their research, but it never occurred to them to share the data with the public. It's just not what scientists do. But these GIS people came along and created this way to reach everyone in the world, and it kind of changed. I know where we were in the United States, we were kind of brain dead about what to do. You know, politicians really had no answers, and communication was just horrible. But you know, there was just this big breakthrough. So I think there are some examples of these really remarkable events about the use of technology, about how open data can be brought to life and be used, and make the world a better place. Like turning to the SDGs, I think that's a really big opportunity for us. And I'm so excited to be at this meeting to talk about that.
You brought a really great, important topic, which is about sharing research results and information. Like, this topic is very close to my heart because I work in science as well. Professor, you as well, like, I want your insight, like, when it comes to research results visibility, especially like to stakeholders, to government entities, to key decision maker, what is the status that we see right now? How important it is?
Absolutely.
That's a short answer.
It's absolutely important, but it's not only a one way, it's a two-way street. You have to search and use the contact to the decision makers, but the decision makers also have to search and use the contact with the researchers, with the people. At the same time, you have to keep your independence. That means you have to define clearly the boundaries between scientists, decision makers, and politicians. There have to be clear boundaries, because if you don't respect these boundaries, you start intermixing. And at that moment, you introduce immediately bias and other problems. Okay, so that's in theory. The biggest problem here is the language. Because if you use certain words, a scientist might understand a different, put a different content into that word. And even in science, take social science and natural science. It's not so easy to understand each other so that one talks about the same content. Yeah, it's amazing. But if you do an effort, you realize that you mean the same, and that enriches the whole research. That I personally found this amazing how this can work. It's more difficult with politicians. I learned this in a hard way. Expressing something so that the politicians within their comfort zone understand what we mean, and the other way around. So if you talk to politicians, for example, and they ask you a question, you have to discuss first the content of the question. Yeah, because you might understand something different in the question than than your counterpart. So you have to develop the question, and you have to develop the question in such a way that you can answer it scientifically. Yeah, because what you have to do as a scientist, you have to answer it scientifically. So again, and then in trying to answer that question in the course of the time, you have to interact with the politicians again, because what you find out might change a little bit the content of the question. But here you are again at the boundary between, a clear boundary between the science and the politicians. I find it an amazing field of learning, and of course of slippery surface. I mean, it's clear. But it is absolutely vital that politicians, decision makers, talk and sometimes follow, or usually follow, the science, because no decision is a good decision without a basis from science and research. That has to be in.
That's great. You've talked about having conversations between different peoples with different understandings. I believe, Ms. Yana, you have such experience with having different partners. So give me your thoughts on the importance of having diverse yet open conversations between different entities, especially when it comes to the advancement of space-based data.
You know, so far we've been painting a very rosy picture of data and what it's powering and empowering, but to be quite honest, we're still far from the ideal. We have delusion, abundance of data. We have actually abundance of solutions, but we also have significant areas of gaps of data and gaps of knowledge and gaps of just empowerment. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves that we still have some distance to go, especially when it comes to actually the most vulnerable communities like the large ocean states or the small island development states or the indigenous communities in the Amazon. Speaking of the large ocean states in particular and small island states, I was in the Pacific last December, and the global products don't actually provide quality information over their region. So it is important for us to recognize this and then continue to evolve our programs in a way that bring that inclusivity that Her Excellency talked about and involve these groups and these communities in our efforts of measuring, monitoring, mapping, so that these dark spots can actually be lit with science, with knowledge, with information. Clint talked about the Living Atlas and the Impact Observatory's land cover map. You know, there are several such products. There are also several, let's just take wetland monitoring programs. Over 30 of them worldwide, different institutions have mapped wetlands. But countries who are parties to the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, a great number of them still do not have information on wetlands to create their national wetlands inventories. So that tells you that the system is not really perfect. So we have, in fact, sort of created an environment where we have, on one hand, proliferation of product solutions, but also fragmentation. And so the real opportunity that we see in GEO is actually to act as a broker, as a neutral convener of all of these different actors and entities who've done very, very good work, but also identify the communities that haven't been addressed by this work and bring them together and create a more integrative kind of a new solution that pieces these pieces together and provides a more holistic kind of integrated view of, let's say, the world's ecosystems and biodiversity. And creating such a capability from all these 32 programs on wetlands, another 10 land cover maps, another 10 mangrove monitoring, another I don't know how many of marine coastal areas, will actually allow us to create an opportunity for coherence in policy, coherence in environmental governance system, coherence in national level decisions, coherence in investments, so that we can in fact have a more harmonized, standardized reference point for that critical information. And we are in fact just in the process of developing this very innovative program. It's innovative because it actually will force these partners to collaborate. And sometimes that's the best disruption we can actually aim for, is getting that robust collaboration, but also in the way that will allow us to collect data over areas where data has not been collected. Because those land masses so small in the large ocean states, the Sentinel missions actually, they turn off their sensors when they go over those areas to conserve energy. So we need to communicate with these critical data providers that there are populations there on the ground for whom getting access to information is actually a matter of survival, cultural survival, physical survival. And so we are really excited to be convening this global ecosystem, we call it Atlas at the moment, but it's probably going to have a different name, program that will give us real insights into the terrestrial, freshwater, marine ecosystems, their functions, their interdependencies in near real time, and filling the gaps that currently exist with artificial intelligence, but also with the participation of the local communities who live in those uncovered areas. And there, something very interesting also comes into play. As we use artificial intelligence, even its development has to be participatory, because when we talk about indigenous people who live in some of those areas, they use very different language than our modern English. And so even this machine learning and artificial intelligence has to be trained with the language which none of us in this room speak. So to us, this program that we are really developing just now, and would love to have the UAE to be one of the first partners here, is going to address all of those critical gaps, both in data, inclusivity, and coherence.
You brought a lot of great points, and it's really unfortunate that we don't have a lot of time. But Mr. Clint, Yana mentioned gaps, and then between people, communication between different partners. How can we bridge these gaps? Like when you have like data providers and different data users that we need to connect to. Give us your line of thoughts in 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate what you had to say, Yana. It's quite remarkable. And I think that's really a great initiative. And we would want to be standing in support of that. As you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about is we have an expression, all of us have this expression, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And part of how do we help and enable other parts of the world so that no one gets left behind. Everybody can have access to information that really helps them solve their problems. Part of that is how the rest of us create educational materials and promote the idea of learning these approaches that can be used. It's useful to tap into people who have experience, that kind of deep insight that comes from tough learning, to solve tough problems, that should be a part of that kind of educational perspective. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is that focus on education. And it's interesting to me because if you look at our young children, they're all growing up as digital natives. So they're just they have a different approach to thinking about problems than we did when we were growing up. And they're more prepared to take these things on. Having said that, there's still a certain amount of leadership and I think kind of deeper education and insight that we all have to be aware of that we need to provide.
Thank you so much, and great thanks to Professor and Yana as well for this informative session. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I've learned a lot and I hope everyone enjoyed this session. Thank you, everyone.